Parenting and Your Child's Shadow 58 Part 3 Shadow Boxing, The Dance of Envy, Anger, and Deceit 6312. Christine Downing Sisters and Brothers Casting Shadows 6513. Sharp My Brother, Myself 6914. Scarf Asterisk Meeting Our Opposites in Husbands and Wives 7215. Michael Ventura Shadow Dancing in the Marriage Zone 76 Part 4 The Disowned Body, Illness, Health, and Sexuality 83. John P. Is Shadow 8417. Marcus S. Anatomy of Evil 8818. Dossie, The Light of Health, The Shadow of Illness. Page 11. Alfred J. Ziegler Illness is Descent into the Body 9320. Adolf Guggenbiel Craig The Demonic Side of Sexuality 97 Part 5 The Shadow of Achievement, The Dark Side of Work in Progress Introduction 10321. Bruce Shackleton Meeting the Shadow at Work 10522. John R. The Dark Side of Success. Guggenbiel Craig Quacks, Charlatans, and False Prophets 110. Sinitar Using Our Flaws and Faults 1. Glendening When Technology Wounds 1-1. Bishop Wilderness as a Victim of Progress 120 Part 6 Meeting Darkness on the Path, The Hidden Sides of Religion and Spirituality Introduction. Brother David Steindl Rast The Shadow in Christianity 13128. William Carl Eichmann Meeting the Dark Side in Spiritual Practice 134. Katie Butler Encountering the Shadow in Buddhist America. Georg F. Seorstein The Shadow of the Enlightened GU, M 14831. W. A Heretic in a New Age Community. Page 12. The Shadow in Astrology 33. Sally Nichols The Devil in the Tarot 34. John Babb's New Age Fundamentalism 153,156,160 Part 7 Devils, Demons, and Scapegoats, A Psychology of Evil Introduction 35. C. G. Jung The Problem of Evil Today 36. Rollo May, The Dangers of Innocence 37. M. Scott Peck Healing Human Evil 38. Stephen A. Our Devils and Demons. Ernest Becker The Basic Dynamic of Human Evil. Andrew Bard Schmookler acknowledging our inner split 165 quintillion 170 quadrillion 173 trillion 176 billion 180 million 186,189 parts enemy making, as in them in the body politic introduction. Sam Keen the enemy maker. Fran Peavy, with Myrna Levy and Charles Varon. As in them 43 Susan Griffin the chauvinist mind. Audre Lorde America's Outsiders 45 Jerome S. Bernstein D.U. Mirror. Page 13. J. Lifton doubling and the Nazi doctors 21847. Adolf Guggenbiel Craig Why Psychopaths Do Not Rule the World 22348. Jerry Fierkenstad Who Are the Criminals? 22649. James Yandel Devils on the Freeway 233 Part 9 Shadow Work Bringing Light to the Darkness Through Therapy, Story, and Dreams Introduction 23950. James Hillman The Cure of the Shadow 24251. Sheldon B. Kopp. Lofa Descent into Hell. Campbell. Of the Whale. The Usefulness of the Useless. Karen Signell Working with Women's Dreams. Janice Brewy and Anne Brennan Emergence of the Shadow in Midlife 260-56. Daniel J. For the Man at Midlife. John Frey Ron How to Deal with Evil 264 Part 10 Owning Your Dark Side Through Insight, Art, and Ritual Introduction 271-58. Ken will BCR Taking Responsibility for Your Shadow 273. Robert Bly Eating the Shadow. Page 14. Daniel Brandon, Taking Back the Disowned Self 280. Hal Stone and Sidra Winkleman. Love with the Demonic Self. Bradshaw. The Shameful Inner Voice. Maximization of business growth and progress, expressed in leveraged buyouts, profiteering, insider trading, and the savings and loan debacle. Materialistic hedonism, expressed in conspicuous consumption, exploitative advertising, waste, and rampant pollution. Desire to control our innately uncontrollable intimate lives, expressed in widespread narcissism, personal exploitation, manipulation of others, and abuse of women and children. Our ever-present fear of death, expressed in an obsession with health and fitness, diet, drugs, and longevity at any price. And in our ever-present fear of death, expressed in an obsession with health and fitness, diet, drugs, and longevity at any price. These shadowy aspects run the width and breadth of our society. Humanity, I wonder why there is not more of it. Woody Allen, Hannah and Her Sisters. In 1886, more than a decade before Freud plumbed the depths of human darkness, Robert Louis Stevenson had a highly revealing dream. A male character, pursued for a crime, swallows a powder and undergoes a drastic change of character, so drastic that he is unrecognizable. The kind, hard working scientist Dr. Jekyll is transformed into the violent and relentless Mr. Hyde, whose evil takes on greater and greater proportions as the dream story unfolds. Stevenson developed the dream into the now famous tale The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Its theme has become so much a part of popular culture that we may think of it when we hear someone say, "I was not my self," or "he was like a demon possessed," or "she became a shrew." As Jungian analyst John Sanford points out, when a story like this one touches the chord of our humanity in such a way that it rings true for many people, it must have an archetypal quality, it must speak to a place in us that is universal. Each of us contains both a Dr. Jekyll and a Mr. Hyde, a more pleasant persona for everyday wear and a hiding, nighttime self that remains hushed up much of the time. Negative emotions and behaviors, rage, jealousy, shame, lying, resentment, lust, greed, suicidal and murderous tendencies lie concealed just beneath the surface, masked by our more proper selves. Known together in psychology as the personal shadow, it remains untamed, unexplored territory to most of us. Introducing the shadow. The personal shadow develops naturally in every young child. As we identify with ideal personality characteristics such as politeness and generosity, which are reinforced in our environments, we shape what W. Brew Joy calls the New Year's resolution self. At the same time, we bury in the shadow those qualities that don't fit our self-image, such as rudeness and selfishness. The XVI. Introduction 17. Ego and the shadow, then, develop in tandem, creating each other out of the same life experience. Carl Jung saw the inseparability of ego and shadow in himself in a dream that he describes in his autobiography, Memories, Dreams, Reflections. It was night in some unknown place, and I was making slow and painful headway against a mighty wind. Dense fog was flying along everywhere. I had my hands cupped around a tiny light which threatened to go out at any moment. Everything depended on my keeping this little light alive. Suddenly I had the feeling that something was coming up behind me. I looked back and saw a gigantic black figure following me, but at the same moment I was conscious in spite of my terror that I must keep my little light going through night and wind, regardless of all dangers. When I awoke, I realized at once that the figure was my own shadow on the swirling mists brought into being by the little light I was carrying. I knew, too, that this little light was my consciousness, the only light I have. Though infinitely small and fragile in comparison with the powers of darkness, it is still a light, my only light. Many forces play a role in forming our shadow selves, ultimately determining what is permitted expression and what is not. Parents, siblings, teachers, clergy, and friends create a complex environment in which we learn what is kind, proper, moral behavior, and what is mean-spirited, shameful, and sinful. The shadow acts like a psychic immune system, defining what is self and what is not self. For different people, in different families and cultures, what falls into ego and what falls into shadow can vary. For instance, some permit anger or aggression to be expressed, most do not. Some permit sexuality, vulnerability, or strong emotions, many do not. Some permit financial ambition, or artistic expression, or intellectual development, while some do not. All the feelings and capacities that are rejected by the ego and exiled into the shadow contribute to the hidden power of the dark side of human nature. However, not all of them are what we consider to be negative traits. According to Jungian analyst Liliane Frcy Ron, this dark treasury includes our infantile parts, emotional attachments, neurotic symptoms, as well as our undeveloped talents and gifts. The shadow, she says, retains contact with the lost depths of the soul, with life and vitality, the superior, the universally Human, yes, even the creative can be sensed there. Disowning the shadow. We cannot look directly into this hidden domain i.e. shadow by nature is difficult to apprehend. It is dangerous, disorderly, and forever in hiding, as if the light-out consciousness would steal its very life. Prolific Jungian analyst James 1 Lillian Savs, illy unconscious cannot be conscious, the moon has its dark side, the sun goes down and cannot shine everywhere at once, and even KXL has two hands. Attention and focus require 18 meeting the shadow. Some things to be out of the field of vision, to remain in the dark. One can not look both ways. For this reason, we see the shadow mostly indirectly, in the distasteful traits and actions of other people, out there where it is safer to observe it. When we react intensely to a quality in an individual or group, such as laziness or stupidity, sensuality, or spirituality, and our reaction overtakes us with great loathing or admiration, this may be our own shadow showing. We project by attributing this quality to the other person in an unconscious effort to banish it from ourselves, to keep ourselves from seeing it within. Jungian analyst Marie-Louise von Franz suggests that projection is like shooting a magic arrow. If the receiver has a soft spot to receive the projection, it sticks. If we project our anger onto a dissatisfied mate, our seductive charms onto a good-looking stranger, or our spiritual attributes onto a guru, we hit the target and the projection holds. From then on, the sender and receiver are linked in a mysterious alliance, like falling in love, discovering a perfect hero or a perfect villain. So the personal shadow contains undeveloped, unexpressed potentials of all kinds. It is that part of the unconscious that is complementary to the ego and represents those characteristics that the conscious personality does not wish to acknowledge and therefore neglects, forgets, and buries, only to discover them in uncomfortable confrontations with others. Meeting the shadow. Although we cannot gaze at it directly, the shadow does appear in daily life. For example, we meet it in humor, such as dirty jokes or slapstick antics, which express our hidden, inferior, or feared emotions. When we observe closely that which strikes us as funny, such as someone slipping on a banana peel or referring to a taboo body part, we discover that the shadow is active. John Sanford points out that people who lack a sense of humor probably have a very repressed shadow. It's usually the shadow self who laughs at jokes. English psychoanalyst Molly Tubby suggests 6 other ways in which, even unknowingly, we meet the shadow every day. In our exaggerated feelings about others, I just can't believe he would do that. I don't know how she could wear that outfit. In negative feedback from others who serve as our mirrors, this is the 3rd time you arrived late without calling me. In those interactions in WHCH, we continually have the same troubling effect on several different people. Sam and I both feel that you have not been straightforward with us. In our impulsive and inadvertent acts, oops, I didn't mean to say that. In situations in which we are humiliated, I'm so ashamed about how he treats me. Introduction 19. In our exaggerated anger about other people's faults, she just can't seem to do her work on time. Boy, he really let his weight get out of control. At moments like these, when we are possessed by strong feelings of shame or anger, or we find that our behavior is off the mark in some way, the shadow is erupting unexpectedly. Usually it recedes just as quickly, because meeting the shadow can be a frightening and shocking experience to our self-image. For this reason, we may quickly shift into denial, hardly noticing the murderous fantasy, suicidal thought, or embarrassing envy that could reveal a bit of our own darkness. The late psychiatrist R.D. Long poetically describes the mind's denial reflex. The range of what we think and do is limited by what we fail to notice. And because we fail to notice that we fail to notice, there is little we can do to change until we notice how failing to notice shapes our thoughts and deeds. If the denial holds, as Long says, then we may not even notice that we fail to notice. For example, it's common to meet the shadow at midlife, when one's deeper needs and values tend to change direction, perhaps even making A 180-degree turn. This calls for breaking old habits and cultivating dormant talents. If we don't stop to heed the call and continue to move in the same life direction, we will remain unaware of what midlife has to teach. Depression, too, can be a paralyzing confrontation with the dark side, a contemporary equivalent of the mystic's dark night of the soul. The inner demand for a descent into the underworld can be overridden by outer concerns, such as the need to work long hours, distractions by other people, or antidepressant drugs, which damp our feelings of despair. In this case, we fail to grasp the purpose of our melancholy. Meeting the shadow calls for slowing the pace of life, listening to the body's cues, and allowing ourselves to be alone in order to digest the cryptic messages from the hidden world. The collective shadow. Today we are confronted with the dark side of human nature each time we open a newspaper or watch the evening news. The more repugnant effects of the shadow are made visible to us in a daily prodigious media message that is broadcast globally throughout our modern electronic village. The world has become a stage for the collective shadow. XX meeting the shadow. The collective shadow, human evil, is staring back at us virtually everywhere. It shouts from newsstand headlines, it wanders our streets, sleeping in doorways, homeless, it squats in X-rated neon-lit shops on the peripheries of our cities, it embezzles our monies from the local savings and loan, it corrupts power-hungry politicians and perverts our systems of justice, it drives invading armies through dense jungles and across desert sands, it sells arms to mad leaders and gives the profits to reactionary insurgents, it pours pollution through hidden pipes into our rivers and oceans, and poisons our food with invisible pesticides. These observations are not some new fundamentalism thumping on a biblical version of reality. Our era has made forced witnesses of us all. The whole world is watching. There is no way to avoid the frightening specter of satanic shadows acted out by conniving politicians, white-collar criminals, and fanatic terrorists. Our inner desire to be whole, now made manifest in the machinery of global communication, forces us to face the conflicting hypocrisy that is everywhere today. While most individuals and groups live out the socially acceptable side of life, others seem to live out primarily the socially disowned parts. When they become the object of negative group projections, the collective shadow takes the form of scapegoating, racism, or enemy making. To anti-communist Americans, the USSR is the evil empire. To Muslims, America is the great Satan. To Nazis, the Jews are vermin Bolsheviks. To ascetic Christian monks, witches are in league with the devil. To South African advocates of apartheid are American members of the Ku Klux Klan, blacks are subhu man, undeserving of the rights and privileges of whites. The hypnotic power and contagious nature of these strong emotions are evident in the universal pervasiveness of racial persecution, religious wars, and scapegoating tactics around the world. In these ways, human beings attempt to dehumanize others in an effort to ensure that they are wearing the white hats, and that killing the enemy does not mean killing human beings like themselves. Throughout history, the shadow has appeared via the human imagina. Tion is a monster, a dragon, a Frankenstein, a white whale, an extraterrestrial, or a man so vile that we cannot see ourselves in him. He is as removed from us as a gorgon. Revealing the dark side of human nature has been, then, one of the primary purposes of art and literature. As Nietzsche puts it, we have art so that we shall not die of reality. By using arts and media, including political propaganda, to imagine something is evil or demonic, we attempt to gain power over it, to break its spell. This may help explain why we are riveted to violent news stories of warmongers and religious fanatics. Repelled yet drawn to the violence and chaos of our world, in our minds we turn these others into the containers of evil, the enemies of civilization. Projection also may help explain the immense popularity of horror November else in movies. Through a vicarious enactment of the shadow side, our evil impulses can be stimulated and perhaps relieved in the safety of the book or theater. Introduction 21. Children typically are introduced to shadow issues by listening to fairy Tales that portray the war between good and evil forces, fairy godmothers, and horrific demons. They, too, vicariously suffer the trials of their heroes and heroines, thereby learning the universal patterns of human fate. In today's censorship battle in the arenas of media and music, those who would throttle the voice of darkness may not understand its urgent need to be heard. In an effort to protect the young, the censors rewrite Little Red Riding Hood so that she is no longer eaten by the wolf, and, in the end, the young are left unprepared to meet the evil they encounter. Like a society, each family also has its built-in taboos, its forbidden arenas. The family shadow contains all that is rejected by a family's conscious awareness, those feelings and actions that are seen as too threatening to its self-image. In an upright Christian, conservative family, this may mean getting drunk or marrying someone of another faith. In a liberal, atheistic family, it may mean choosing a gay relationship. In our society, wife battering and child abuse used to be hidden away in the family shadow. Today they have emerged in epidemic proportions into the light of day. The dark side is not a recent evolutionary appearance, the result of civilization and education. It has its roots in a biological shadow that is based in our very cells. Our animal ancestors, after all, survived with tooth and claw. The beast in us is very much alive, just caged most of the time. Many anthropologists and sociobiologists believe that human evil is a result of curbing our animal aggression, of choosing culture over nature, and losing contact with our primitive wildness. Physician anthropologist Melvin Connor tells the story in The Tangled Wing of going to a zoo and seeing a sign that reads, "The most dangerous animal on earth," only to discover that he is looking in the mirror. Know thyself. In ancient times, human beings acknowledged the many dimensions of the shadow, the personal, collective, family, and biological. On the lintel pieces of the now destroyed Temple of Apollo at Delphi, which was built into the side of Mount Parnassus by the Greeks of the classical period, the temple priests set into stone two famous inscriptions, precepts that still hold great meaning for us today. The first of these, "Know thyself," applies broadly to our task. Know all of yourself, the priest or the god of light advised, which could be translated, know especially the dark side. We are in direct lineage to the Greek mind. Our shadow self remains the great burden of self-knowledge, the disruptive element that does not want to be known. The Greeks understood this problem all too well, and their legion compensated for the underside of light. It was oil the same mountainside above Delphi that the Greeks annually celebrated their famous bacchanal revels, orgies that glorified the forceful, creative presence of the nature god Dionysus in human beings. 22. Meeting the shadow. Today, Dionysus exists for us only in degraded form in our cloven I am. Ages of Satan, the devil, the personification of evil. No longer a god to be acknowledged and receive our tribute, he is banished to the world of fallen angels. Marie-Louise von Franz acknowledges the relationship between the devil and the personal shadow when she says the principle of individuation is actually related to the devilish element, insofar as the latter represents a separation from the divine within the totality of nature. The devilish aspects are the disrupting elements, the effects, the autonomous power drive, and such things. They disrupt the unity of the personality. Nothing to excess. The other inscription at Delphi is perhaps more telling of the times in which we live. Nothing to excess, the Greek god proclaims from his now crumbled earthly shrine. The classicist E.R. Dodd suggests an interpretation of this motto. Only a people who knew excess, he says, could have lived by such a maxim. Only those who knew their capacity for lust, greed, rage, gluttony, and for all things excessive, who have understood and accepted their own potential for inappropriate extremes, can choose to regulate and humanize their actions. We live in a time of critical excess, too many people, too much crime, too much exploitation, too much pollution, too many nuclear weapons. These are excesses that we can acknowledge and decry, though we may feel power less to do anything about them. Is there, in fact, anything we can do about them? For many people, the Unacceptable qualities of excess go directly into the unconscious shadow, or they get expressed in shadowy behavior. In many of our lives, these extremes take the form of symptoms, intensely negative feelings and actions, neurotic suffering, psychosomatic illnesses, depression, and substance abuse. The scenarios might look like this: when we feel excessive desire, we push it into the shadow, then act it out without concern for others. When we feel excessive hunger, we push it into the shadow, then overeat, binge, and purge, trashing our bodies. When we feel excessive longing for the high side of life, we push it into the shadow, then we seek it out through instant gratification or hedonistic activities such as drug and alcohol abuse. The list goes on. In our society, we see the growth of shadow excesses everywhere. In an uncontrolled power drive for knowledge and domination of nature, expressed in the immorality of the sciences and the unregulated marriage of business and technology. In a self-righteous compulsion to help and cure others, expressed in the distorted, codependent role of those in the helping professions and the greed of doctors and pharmaceutical companies. In a fast-paced, dehumanized workplace, expressed by the apathy of an Introduction 23. Alienated workforce, the unplanned obsolescence produced by automation, and the hubris of success. In the maximization of business growth and progress, expressed in leveraged buyouts, profiteering, insider trading, and the savings and loan debacle. In a materialistic hedonism, expressed in conspicuous consumption, exploitative advertising, waste, and rampant pollution. In a desire to control our innately uncontrollable intimate lives, expressed in widespread narcissism, personal exploitation, manipulation of others, and abuse of women and children. And in our ever-present fear of death, expressed in an obsession with health and fitness, diet, drugs, and longevity at any price. These shadowy aspects run the width and breadth of our society. However, the tried solutions to our collective excess may be even more dangerous than the problem. Consider, for example, fascism and authoritarianism, the horrors that arose in reactionary attempts to contain social disorder and wide spread decadence and permissiveness in Europe. More recently, the fervor of religious and political fundamentalism has reawakened on our own shores and across the seas in response to progressive ideas, encouraging, in W.B. Yeats's words, mere anarchy to be loosed upon the world. Jung understated the case when he said, "We have in all naivete forgotten that beneath our world of reason another lies buried. I do not know what humanity will still have to undergo before it dares to admit this. If not now, when? History records from time immemorial the plagues of human evil. Entire nations have been susceptible to being pulled into mass hysterias of vast destructive proportions. Today, with the apparent end of the Cold War, there are some hopeful exceptions. For the first time, entire nations have become self-reflective and have tried to reverse direction. Consider this newspaper report, which speaks for itself, as cited by Jerome S. Bernstein in his book Power and Politics. The Soviet government announced that it was temporarily canceling all history examinations in the country. The Philadelphia Inquirer of June 1988 reported the Soviet Union, saying history textbooks had taught generations of Soviet children lies that poisoned their minds and souls, announced yesterday that it had canceled final history exams for more than 53 million students. Reporting the cancellation, the government newspaper Izvestia said the extraordinary decision was intended to end the passing of lies from generation to generation, a process that has consolidated the Stalinist political and economic system that the current leadership wants to end. after another is immeasurable, the paper said in a front page commentary. Today we are reaping the bitter fruits of our own moral laxity. We are paying for succumbing to conformity and thus to giving silent approval of everything that now brings the blush of shame to our faces and about which we do not by an entire nation could mark the end of an era. According to Sam Keane, author of Faces of the Enemy, the only safe nations are those who systematically inoculate themselves by a free press and a vocal prophetic minority against the intoxication of divine destinies and sanctified paranoia. Today the world moves in two apparently opposing directions. Some leap away from fanatic, totalitarian regimes, others dig their feet in. We may feel helpless in the face of such great forces, or, if we feel about such things at all, surely it must be the guilty conscience of unwitting complicity in our collective predicament. This bind was expressed accurately by Jung at mid-century. The inner voice brings to consciousness whatever the whole, whether the nation to which we belong or humanity of which we are a part, suffers from. But it presents this evil in individual form, so that at first we would suppose all this evil to be only a trait of individual character. To protect us from the human evil which these mass unconscious forces can enact, we have only one weapon: greater individual awareness. If we fail to learn or fail to act on what we learn from the spectacle of human behavior, we forfeit our power as individuals to either ourselves, and thus to save our world. Yes, evil will always be with us. But the consequences of unchecked evil do not need to be tolerated. A great change of our psychological attitude is imminent, Jung said in J 959. The only real danger that exists is man himself. He is the great danger. And we are pitifully unaware of it. We are the origin of all coming evil. Cartoonist Walt Kelly's Pogo said it simply: we have met the enemy and he is us. Today, we can give renewed psychological meaning to the idea of individual power. The frontier for action in confronting the shadow is, as it always has been, in the individual. Owning the shadow. The aim of meeting the shadow is to develop an ongoing relationship with it. To expand our sense of self by balancing the one-sidedness of our conscious attitudes with our unconscious depths. Novelist Tom Robbins says the purpose in encountering the shadow is to be in the right place in the right way. When we are in a proper relationship to it, the unconscious is not a demonical monster, as Jung points out. It only becomes dangerous when our conscious attention to it is hopelessly wrong. Introduction 25. A right relationship with the shadow offers us a great gift to lead us back to our buried potentials. Through shadow work, a term we coined to refer to the continuing effort to develop a creative relationship with the shadow, we achieve a more genuine self-acceptance based on a more complete knowledge of who we are. Diffuse the negative emotions that erupt unexpectedly in our daily lives. Feel more free of the guilt and shame associated with our negative feelings and actions. Recognize the projections that color our opinion of others. Heal our relationships through more honest self-examination and direct communication. And use the creative imagination via dreams, drawing, writing, and rituals to own the disowned self. Perhaps we can also, in this way, refrain from adding our personal darkness to the density of the collective shadow. British Jungian analyst and astrologer Liz Green points to the paradoxical nature of the shadow as both the container of darkness and the beacon pointing toward the light. It is the suffering, crippled side of the personality, which is both the dark shadow that won't change and also the redeemer that transforms one's life and alters one's values. The redeemer can get the hidden treasure or win the princess or slay the dragon because he's marked in some way. He's abnormal. The shadow is both the awful thing that needs redemption and the suffering redeemer who can provide it. Party. What is the shadow? Everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. At all counts, it forms an unconscious snag, thwarting our most well-meant intentions. C. G. Jung. Yet there is a mystery here, and it is not one that I understand, without this sting of otherness, of even the vicious, without the terrible energies of the underside of health, sanity, sense, then nothing works or can work. I tell you that goodness, what we in our ordinary daylight selves call goodness, the ordinary, the decent, these are nothing without the hidden powers that pour forth continually from their shadow sides. Doris Lessing. Man's shadow, I thought, is his vanity. Friedrich Nietzsche. This thing of darkness I acknowledge mine. William Shakespeare. Introduction. Everything with substance casts a shadow. The ego stands to the shadow as light to shade. This is the quality that makes us human. Much as we would like to deny it, we are imperfect. And perhaps it is in what we don't accept about ourselves, our aggression and shame, our guilt and pain, that we discover our humanity. The shadow goes by many familiar names: the disowned self, the lower self, the dark twin or brother in Bible and myth, the double, repressed self, alter ego, id. When we come face to face with our darker side, we use meta first to describe these shadow encounters, meeting our demons, wrestling with the devil, descent to the underworld, dark night of the soul, midlife crisis. We all have a shadow. Or does our shadow have us? Carl Jung turned this question into a riddle when he asked, how do you find a lion that has swallowed you? Because the shadow is by definition unconscious, it is not always possible to know whether or not we are under the sway of some compelling part of our shadow's contents. Jung said that intuitively each of us understands what is meant by the terms shadow, inferior personality, or alter ego. And if he has forgotten, he joked about the average man, his memory can easily be refreshed by a Sunday sermon, his wife, or the tax collector. In order to be capable of meeting the shadow in our daily lives, admitting to it, and thus breaking its often compulsive hold on us, we need first of all a comprehensive understanding of the phenomenon. The shadow concept flows out of discoveries made by Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung. Paying due respect to his predecessor, Jung acknowledged Freud's breakthrough work as the most detailed and profound analysis of the split between the light and dark sides of the human psyche. According to Jung's former student and colleague, Liliane Frey-Ron, as early as 191-2, while still under the influence of Freud's theories, Jung used the term shadow side of the psyche to characterize not recognized desires and repressed portions of the personality. In 1917, in his essay on the psychology of the unconscious, Jung speaks of the personal shadow as the other in us, the unconscious personality of the same sex, the reprehensible interior, the other that embarrasses or shames us. By shadow I mean that negative one side of the personality, the sum of all those unpleasant qualities we like to hide, together with the insufficiently developed functions and the content of the personal unconscious. The shadow is negative only from the point of view of consciousness. It is not, as Freud insisted, totally immoral and incompatible with our conscious personalities. Rather, it potentially contains values of the highest. 3. For meeting the shadow. Morality. This is particularly true, says Frcy Ron, when there is a side hid then in the shadow personality which society values as positive, yet which is regarded by the individual as inferior. The shadow most closely approaches what Freud understood as the repressed. But in contrast to Freud's view, Jung's shadow is an inferior personality that has its own contents, such as autonomous thought, ideas, images, and value judgments that are similar to the superior, conscious personality. By 1945, Jung was referring to the shadow as simply the thing a person has no wish to be. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, he said, but by making the darkness conscious. The latter procedure, however, is disagreeable and therefore not popular. Today, shadow refers to that part of the unconscious psyche that is near to consciousness, even though it is not completely accepted by it. Because It is contrary to our chosen conscious attitude. The shadow personality is de need expression in life and coalesces into a relatively separate splinter person ality in the unconscious, where it is isolated from exposure and discovery. This compensates for the one-sided identification we make with what is AC acceptable to our conscious minds. For Jung and his followers, psychotherapy offers a ritual for renewal in which the shadow personality can be brought to awareness and assimilated, thus reducing its inhibiting or destructive potentials and releasing trapped positive life energy. Jung continued to be concerned with the related problems of personal destructiveness and collective evil throughout a long and distinguished career. His investigations showed that dealing with shadow and evil is ultimately an individual secret equal to that of experiencing God, and so powerful an experience that it can transform the whole person. Jung sought answers to the perplexing questions that trouble each of us, says Jungian scholar Andrew Samuels, and his life's work provides a convincing explanation not only of personal antipathies but also the cruel prejudices and persecutions of our time. Jung saw his own destiny as that of an explorer, a man who creates new ways of conceptualizing age-old problems, psychological problems, as well as philosophical, spiritual, and religious ones. He said that he wanted to address those people who seek meaning in their lives but for whom the traditional carriers of faith and religion no longer work. In the 1937 publication Psychology and Religion, Jung said, probably all that is left us today is the psychological approach. That is why I take these thought forms that have become historically fixed, try to melt them down again and pour them into molds of immediate experience. Robert A. Johnson, a well-known author and lecturer whose writing is in the third generation of Jungian ideas, says that Jung's lasting contribution was the development of a magnificent vision of the human capacity for consciousness. He posited a model of the unconscious so momentous that the Western world has still not fully caught up with its implications. Perhaps Jung's greatest accomplishment was to reveal the unconscious to be the creative source of all that we eventually become as individuals. In fact, our conscious minds and personalities develop and mature, Ram the Ramate. Real of the unconscious, in interactive play with life experiences. Part 1 Introduction 5. Along with self, the psychological center of the human being, an anima. An animus, the internalized ideal images of the opposite sex, the soul image. In each person, Jung classified the shadow as one of the major archetypes in the personal unconscious. Archetypes are innate, inherited structures in the unconscious, like psychological fingerprints, which contain preformed characteristics, personal qualities, and traits shared with all other human beings. They are living psychic forces within the human psyche. According to the Critical Dictionary of Jungian Analysis, gods are metaphors of archetypal behaviors and myths are archetypal enactments. The course of Jungian analysis involves a growing awareness of this archetypal dimension of a person's life. To introduce and define the personal shadow in Part 1, we have chosen several outstanding examples from Jungian writers because it is in these formulations that the concept has become well known and useful as a tool for personal growth and therapeutic healing. The writers in this section address the essential issues that make it possible for us to perceive the shadow in everyday living. In later sections of this book, the concept is broadened from its personal to its collective manifestations in prejudice, war, and evil in essays chosen from a wide range of ideas. In opening this section, poet Robert Bly uses a personal voice to narrate the story of the shadow in an excerpt from a little book on the human shadow. The disowned self, says Bly, becomes a holding buffer as we grow up. A long bag we drag behind us that contains our unacceptable parts. Bly also links our personal bags to other kinds, our collective shadows. Next, Jungian training analyst Edward C. Whitmont shows us the therapist's view of the shadow as it appears in patients' dreams and life experiences. This excerpt from The Symbolic Quest gives a sound definition to our theme. What the Shadow Knows, Chapter 3, is a 1989 conversation between San Diego-based analyst and Episcopal minister John A. Sanford and interviewer D. Patrick Miller, which originally appeared in the magazine The Sun. Throughout his career, Sanford has taken on the difficult questions of human evil. His psychological explication of the famous Robert Louis Stevenson story, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, appears as Chapter 5 in this section. The Shadow in History and Literature is an excerpt from Archetypo, A Natural History of the Self by British psychologist Anthony Stevens. Sand. Which, between the two Sanford pieces, this article describes the shadow as it appears in works of the imagination. Chapter 6, The Realization of the Shadow in Dreams, is an essay by eminent psychoanalyst and dream scholar Marie-Louise von Franz, one of Jung's closest collaborators. It comes from Man and His Symbols, a popular book that Dr. von Franz helped to write and edit in concert with Jung and three other loyal disciples in the early 1960s. This source book was C.G. Jung's last living work, a compilations of ideas and images addressed to the broad reading public. We end this section on a constructive note with therapist William A. Miller's piece, Finding the Shadow in Daily Life, from his book Your Golden Shadow. Miller guides us into shadow phenomena by examining projections. 6. Meeting the shadow, slips of the tongue, and humor, and by showing how to discover the shadow in the ordinary events of life. Jung once remarked, in a moment of exasperation about literal-minded pupils quoting his concepts out of context, that the shadow is simply the whole unconscious. Though he was not serious, his observation would be true only if a person were completely unaware of the unconscious in everyday life. Once we begin to develop awareness of parts of the unconscious personality, then the shadow takes on an identifiable personal form, which initiates the process of shadow work. This procedure ultimately yields a profound awareness of who we are. According to analyst Eric Newman, the self lies hidden in the shadow. He is the keeper of the gate, the guardian of the threshold. The way to the self lies through him. Behind the dark aspect that he represents there stands the aspect of wholeness, and only by making friends with the shadow do we gain the friendship of the self. 1. The long bag we drag behind us. Robert Bly. It's an old Gnostic tradition that we don't invent things, we just remember. The Europeans I know of who remember the dark side best are Robert Louis Stevenson, Joseph Conrad, and Carl Jung. I'll call up a few of their ideas and add a few thoughts of my own. Let's talk about the personal shadow first. When we were 1 or 2 years old, we had what we might visualize as a 360-degree personality energy radiated out from all parts of our body and all parts of our psyche. A child running is a living globe of energy. We had a ball of energy, all right, but one day we noticed that our parents didn't like certain parts of that ball. They said things like, "Can't you be still?" Or, "It isn't nice to try and kill your brother." Behind us we have an invisible bag, and the part of us our parents don't like. We to keep our parents' love put in the bag. By the time we go to school, our bag is quite large. Then our teachers have their say. Good children don't get angry over such little things. So we take our anger and put it in the bag. By the time my brother and I were 12 in Madison, Minnesota, we were known as the nice Bly boys. Our bags were already a mile long. Then we do a lot of bag stuffing in high school. This time it's no longer the evil grown-ups that pressure us, but people our own age. So the students' paranoia about grown-ups can be misplaced. I lied all through high school automatically to try to be more like the basketball players. Any part of myself. Robert Bly J. That was a little slow, went into the bag. My sons are going through the process now. I watched my daughters, who were older, experience it. I noticed with dismay how much they put into the bag, but there was nothing their mother or I could do about it. Often my daughters seemed to make their decision on the issue of fashion and collective ideas of beauty, and they suffered as much damage from others' girls as they did from men. So I maintain that out of a round globe of energy, the 20-year-old ends up with a slice. We'll imagine a man who has a thin slice left, the rest is in the bag, and we'll imagine that he meets a woman, let's say they are both 24. She has a thin, elegant slice left. They join each other in a sear. Moni, and this union of two slices is called marriage. Even together the two do not make up one person. Marriage when the bag is large entails loneliness. During the honeymoon for that very reason. Of course we all lie about it. How was your honeymoon? Wonderful, how's yours? Different cultures fill the bag with different contents. In Christian Cole, Toure sexuality usually goes into the bag. With it goes much spontaneity. Marie-Louise von Franz warns us, on the other hand, not to sentimentalize primitive cultures by assuming that they have no bag at all. She says in effect that they have a different but sometimes even larger bag. They may put individuality into the bag, or inventiveness. What anthropologists know as participation mystique, or a mysterious communal mind, sounds lovely, but it can mean that tribal members all know exactly the same thing and no one knows anything else. It's possible that bags for all human beings are about the same size. We spend our life until we're 20 deciding what parts of ourself to put into the bag, and we spend the rest of our lives trying to get them out again. Sometimes retrieving them feels impossible, as if the bag were sealed. Suppose the bag remains sealed, what happens then? A great 19th century story has an idea about that. One night Robert Louis Stevenson woke up and told his wife a bit of a dream he'd just had. She urged him to write it down. He did, and it became Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. The nice side of the personal. ITY becomes, in our idealistic culture, nicer and nicer. The Western man may be a liberal doctor, for example, always thinking about the good of others. Morally and ethically he is wonderful. But the substance in the bag takes on a personality of its own, it can't be ignored. The story says that the substance locked in the bag appears one day somewhere else in the city. The substance in the bag feels angry, and when you suck it, it is shaped like an ape and moves like an ape. The story says then that when we put a part of ourselves in the bag, it regresses. It evolves toward barbarism. Suppose a young man seals a bag at 20 and then waits 15 or 20 years before he opens it again. What will he find? Sadly, the sexuality, the wildness, the impulsiveness, the anger, the freedom he put in have all regressed. They are not only primitive in mood, they are hostile to the person who opens the bag, the man who opens his bag. At 45, or the woman who opens her bag rightly feels fear. She glances up and sees the shadow of an ape passing along the alley wall. Anyone seeing that would be frightened. Ape meeting the shadow. I think we could say that most males in our culture put their feminine side or interior woman into the bag. When they begin, perhaps around 35 or 40, trying to get in touch with their feminine side again, she may be by then truly hostile to them. The same man may experience in the meantime much hostility from women in the outer world. The rule seems to be, the outside has to be like the inside. That's the way it is on this globe. If a woman, wanting to be approved for her femininity, has put her masculine side or her internal male into the bag, she may find that 20 years later he will be hostile to her. Moreover, he may be unfeeling and brutal in his criticism. She's in a spot. Finding a hostile man to live with would give her someone to blame and take away the pressure, but that wouldn't help the problem of the closed bag. In the meantime, she is liable to sense a double rejection from the male inside and the male outside. There's a lot of grief in this whole thing. Every part of our personality that we do not love will become hostile to us. We could add that it may move to a distant place and begin a revolt against us as well. A lot of the trouble Shakespeare's kings experience blossoms in that sentence. Hotspur, in Wales, rebels against the king. Shakespeare's poetry is marvelously sensitive to the danger of these inner revolts. Always the king at the center is endangered. When I visited Bali a few years ago, it became clear that their ancient Hindu culture works through mythology to bring shadow elements up into daily view. The temples put on plays virtually every day from the Ramayana. I saw some terrifying plays performed as a part of religious life, in a day-by-day way. Almost every Balinese house has standing outside it a fierce, toothy, aggressive, hostile figure carved in stone. This being doesn't plan to do good. I visited a mask maker and noticed his 9 or 10-year-old son sitting outside the house, making with his chisel a hostile, angry figure. The person does not aim to act out the aggressive energies as we do in football or the Spanish in bullfighting, but each person aims to bring them upward into art. That is the ideal. The Balinese can be violent and brutal in war, but in daily life they seem much less violent than we are. What can this mean? Southerners in the United States put figures of helpful little black men on the lawn, cast in iron, and we in the North do the same with serene deer. We ask for roses in the wallpaper, Renoir above the sofa, and John Denver on the stereo. Then the aggression escapes from the bag and attacks everyone. We'll have to let this contrast between Balinese and American cultures lie there and go on. I want to talk about the connection between shadow energies and the moving picture projector. Let's suppose that we have miniaturized certain parts of ourselves, flattened them out, and put them inside a can where it will be dark. Then one night, always at night, the shapes reappear. Huge, and we can't take our eyes away from them. We drive at night in the country and see a man and woman on an enormous outdoor movie screen. We shut off the car and watch certain figures who have been rolled up inside a can, doubly invisible by being partially developed and by being kept always in the dark, exist during the day only as pale images on a thin gray strip of film. When a certain light is ignited in the back of our heads, ghostly pictures appear on a wall in front of us. They light cigarettes, they threaten others with Robert Bly 9 guns. Our psyches then are natural projection machines, images that we stored in a can we can bring out while still rolled up and run them for others or on others. A man's anger, rolled up inside the can for 20 years, he may see one night on his wife's face. A wife might see a hero every night on her husband's face and then one night see a tyrant. Nora in A Doll's House saw the two images in turn. The other day I found some of my old diaries, and I picked out one at random from 1956. I had been struggling that year to write a poem describing the nature of advertising men. I remember that, and I recall that at that time the story of Midas was important in my mood. Everything that Midas touched turned to gold. I declared in my poem that every living thing an advertising man touches turns into some form of money, and that's why ad men have such starved souls. I kept in mind the ad men I'd known and was having a good time attacking them from my concealed position. As I read the old passages, I felt a shock seeing the movie I was running. Between the time I wrote them and now, I'd discovered that I had known for years how to eat in such a way as to keep me from taking in any kind of nourishment whatever. Food a friend offered me, or a woman, or a child, turned into metal on the way to my mouth. Is the image clear? No one can eat or drink metal. So Midas was a good image for me. But the film showing my interior Midas was rolled up in the can. Advertising men, evil and foolish, tended to appear at night on a large screen, and I was naturally fascinated. A year or two later I composed a book called Poems for the Ascension of J.P. Morgan, in which each poem I had written about business alternated with a culpable advertisement reproduced from magazines or newspapers. It is a lively book in its way. No one would publish it, but that was all right. It was mostly projection anyway. I'm going to read you a poem I wrote around that time. It's called Unrest. A strange unrest hovers over the nation. This is the last dance, the wild tossing of Morgan's seas. The division of spoils, a lassitude, enters into the diamonds of the body. In high school the explosion begins, the child is partly killed. When the fight is over, and the land and the sea ruined, two shapes inside us rise, and move away. But the baboon whistles on the shores of death, climbing and falling, tossing nuts and stones. He gambles by the nay, whose branches hold the expanses of cold. The planets whirling in the black sun. Theories of insects, and the tiny slaves in the prisons of bark. Charlemagne, we are approaching your islands. We are returning now to the snowy two, and the depth of the darkness buried in snow, through which you rode all night. I meeting the shadow with stiff hands. Now the darkness is falling. in which we sleep and awake, a darkness in which thieves shudder, and the insane have a hunger for snow, in which bankers dream of being buried by black stones, and businessmen fall on their knees in the dungeons of sleep. About 5 years ago, I began to be suspicious of this poem. Why are bankers and businessmen being singled out? If I had to rephrase banker, what would I say? Someone who plans very well. I plan very well. How would I rephrase businessman? Someone with a stiff face. I looked in the mirror then. I'll read you the way the passage goes now, after I've rewritten it. A darkness in which thieves shudder, and the insane have a hunger for snow, in which good planners dream of being buried by black stones, and men with stiff faces like me fall on their knees in the dungeons of sleep. Now when I go to a party, I feel different from the way that I used to when I meet a businessman. I say to a man, "What do you do?" He says, "I'm a stockbroker," and he says it in a faintly apologetic way. I say to myself, "Look at this, something of me that was deep inside me is standing right next to me." I have a funny longing to hug him. Not all of them, of course. But projection is a wonderful thing too. Marie-Louise von Franz Re. Marked somewhere, why do we always assume projection is bad? You are projecting becomes among Jungians an accusation. Sometimes projection is helpful in the right thing. Her remark is very wise. I know that I was starving myself to death, but the knowledge couldn't move directly from the bag to the conscious mind. It has to go out onto the world first. How wicked advertising men are, I said to myself. Marie-Louise von Franz reminds us that if we didn't project, we might never connect with the world at all. Women sometimes complain that a man often takes his ideal feminine side and projects it onto a woman. But if he didn't, how could he get out of his mother's house or his bachelor room? The issue is not so much that we do project, but how long we keep the projections out there. Projection without personal contact is dangerous. Thousands, even millions of American men projected their internal feminine onto Marilyn Monroe. If a million men do that and leave it there, it's likely she will die. She died. Projections without personal contact can damage the person receiving them. We have to also say that Marilyn Monroe called for these projections as a part of her power longing, and her disturbance must have gone back to victimization in childhood. But the process of projection and recall, done so delicately in tribal culture, face to face, goes out of whack when the mass media arrives. In the economy of the psyche, her death was inevitable and even right. No single human being can carry so many projections, that is, so much unconsciousness, and survive. So it's infinitely important that each person bring back his or her own Robert Bly too. But why would we give away, or put into the bag, so much of ourselves? Why would we do it so young? And if we have put away so many of our angers, spontaneities, hungers, enthusiasms, our rowdy and unattractive parts, then how can we live? What holds us together? Alice Miller spoke to this point in her book Prisoners of Childhood, which in paperback form is called The Drama of the Gifted Child. The drama is this. We came as infants, trailing clouds of glory, arriving from the farthest reaches of the universe, bringing with us appetites well served from our mammal inheritance, spontaneities wonderfully preserved from our 150,000 years of tree life, angers well preserved from our 5,000 years of tribal life, in short, with our 360-degree radiance, and we offered this gift to our parents. They didn't want it. They wanted a nice girl or a nice boy. That's the first act of the drama. It doesn't mean our parents were wicked, they needed us for something. My mother, as a second-generation immigrant, needed my brother and me to help the family look more classy. We do the same thing to our children. It's a part of life on this planet. Our parents rejected who we were before we could talk, so the pain of rejection is probably stored in some pre-verbal place. When I read her book, I fell into depression for 3 weeks. With so much gone, what can we do? We can construct a personality more acceptable to our parents. Alice Miller agrees that we have betrayed ourselves, but she says, don't blame yourself for that. There's nothing else you could have done. Children in ancient times who opposed their parents probably were set out to die. We did, as children, the only sensible thing under the circumstances. The proper attitude toward that, she says, is mourning. Let's talk now about the different sorts of bags. When we have put a lot in our private bag, we often have as a result little energy. The bigger the bag, the less the energy. Some people have by nature more energy than others, but we all have more than we can possibly use. Where did it go? If we put our sexuality into the bag as a child, obviously we lose a lot of energy. When a woman puts her masculinity into the bag, or rolls it up and puts it into the can, she loses energy with it. So we can think of our personal bag as containing energy now unavailable to us. If we identify ourselves asterisk as uncreative, it means we took our creativity and put it into the bag. What do you mean, I am not creative? Let experts do it. Isn't that what such a person is saying? That's damn well what such people are saying. The audience wants a poet, a hired gun, to come in from out of town. Everybody in this audience should be writing their own poems. We have talked of our personal bag, but each town or community also seems to have a hag. One lived 4 years near a small Minnesota town. Everyone in the town was expected to have the same objects in the bag. A small Greek town clearly would have different objects in the bag. It's as if the town, by collective psychic decision, puts certain energies in the bag and tries to prevent anyone from getting them out. Towns interfere with our private process in this matter, so it's more dangerous to live in them than in nature. On the other hand, certain ferocious hatreds that one feels in a small town help. 12. Meeting the shadow. 1. Sometimes to see where the projections have gone. And the Jungian community, like the town, has its bag, and usually recommends that Jungians keep their vulgarity and love of money in the bag, and the Freudian community usually demands that Freudians keep their religious life in the bag. There is also a national bag, and ours is quite long. Russia and China have noticeable faults, but if an American citizen is curious to know what is in our national bag at the moment, he can listen closely when a State Department official criticizes Russia. As Reagan says, we are noble, other nations have Pires. Other nations under stagnated leadership treat minorities brutally, brainwash their youth, and break treaties. A Russian can find out about his bag by reading a Pravda article on the United States. We're dealing with a network of shadows, a pattern of shadows projected by both sides, all meeting somewhere out in the air. I'm not saying anything new with this metaphor, but I do want to make the distinction clear between the personal shadow, the town shadow, and the national shadow. I have used 3 metaphors here: the bag, the film can, and projection. Since the can or bag is closed and its images remain in the dark, we can only see the contents of our own bag by throwing them innocently, as we say, out into the world. Spiders then become evil, snakes cunning, goats oversexed. Men become linear, women become weak, the Russians become unprincipled, and Chinese all look alike. Yet it is precisely through this expensive, damaging, wasteful, inaccurate form of mud-slinging that we eventually come in touch with the mud that the crow found on the bottom of its feet. 2. The evolution of the shadow. Edward C. Whitmont. The term shadow refers to that part of the personality which has been repressed for the sake of the ego ideal. Since everything unconscious is projected, we encounter the shadow in projection, in our view of the other fellow. As a figure in dreams or fantasies, the shadow represents the personal unconscious. It is like a composite of the personal shells of our complexes and is thus the doorway to all deeper transpersonal experiences. Practically speaking, the shadow more often than not appears as an inferior personality. However, there can also be a positive shadow, which appears when we tend to identify with our negative qualities and repress the positive ones. Edward C. Whitmont. 3. The following example of the shadow is a classical one from a familiar situation. A middle-aged patient complains repeatedly and bitterly about her mother-in-law. Her description seems by and large to be correct and adequate, for her husband, independently of his wife, has provided a description which is practically identical. Mother is seen by both as utterly domineering, never able to admit another person's viewpoint, in the habit of asking for ad. Bison at once deprecating it, always feeling at a disadvantage, abused Mar. Tired and